how are you? Thank you for being here with me today.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited.
Oh, I'm so excited. You're the first deaf parent on the pod place. I'm very excited.
No, thanks for having me. I think it's really important that a deaf family or parent is able to share their experiences for the others.
Absolutely. And you're the first person I thought of because I just think that, we've had lots of communication in the past with our kids, and I just know you have so much knowledge and experience in education as well as a deaf person, raising deaf kids, two beautiful kids. You have Felix, your first, and Sophie, your youngest, and they are absolutely gorgeous. And they are just thriving. And I know that because you are fantastic. And I want to talk about that. But firstly, I thought we would start with just your experience, living as a deaf person, growing up as a deaf person. And I know hearing families really appreciate that perspective about that lived experience because we don't know, It's just great to have someone who can speak about this openly with us. So thank you in advance for doing that. And I'd just like to ask you, what was that like growing up as a deaf person?
Well, I grew up in a hearing family. I had one deaf sister and two hearing brothers, so 4 kids all up. Everyone else in the family were hearing. It's just the two of us that communicated with sign language. We went to a deaf school, and that was in Ballarat. And at the time, it was called the Ewing House School for Deaf Children. So we went there from ages 3 onwards, really until it closed down because the numbers had dwindled. So then we moved to a mainstream school. So when we were in year 7, we did a few subjects over at this mainstream school, but then once Ewing House had closed down, we thought, there must be another way to connect with the deaf community. And my mum was very supportive of that desire of ours. So we would often travel to Melbourne for different events. And we noticed one day that there was a deaf camp that was on, and that had such a profound impact on my life. When we attended this camp, we saw such a diversity of language there. My signing was different to these kids. Their signing was so rich. Out in the country, we had very limited access to Auslan. And once we got to the city and to the camp, we thought, my goodness, it's so different. I remember meeting one friend who's really lovely, but at first, this group of kids looked at us like, look at these two. Their signing's crap. It's so Englishy. It's signed English. We would follow English word order. And that's just because we didn't have access to Auslan and Auslan grammar. So when we saw it, we were like, my goodness, look how creative and fluid it is. But as the camp went on, we started to be introduced to people, and we ended up making friends and meeting a diverse range of people there. And it was incredible. I didn't want to go home. I just wanted to stay in Melbourne forever. And that's when some frustration started to develop. And the reason is my mum wanted to put us out in the community, but really, I felt stuck in the world I was in. As I got older, I began to question my mother, and really, they made the best decision they could at the time. So I've always been a bit stuck on that. But as time went on, I eventually moved to Brisbane. I met my husband, who is deaf as well. And then we've got our 2 beautiful kids now. And I thought, wow, this has just, shaken my world. I never imagined my life in which I would have deaf kids. I always thought I would love children, but I never thought about having deaf kids. I always saw myself as having a family life and having babies, but yeah, it's just been incredible.
Yeah, well, it's actually great that we're talking about that because my first question is about that and that experience as a deaf person yourself, having a deaf baby, finding out your baby is deaf. For hearing parents, that experience, there's a lot of emotion attached to that, a lot of overwhelm, so much shock, everything, right? But was your experience different, do you think? Feeling the same as us as hearing parents or different?
Well, it's funny. When I was first pregnant with my son, I was always unsure, oh, will my child be deaf? Will he be hearing? But then I was always imagining that after he was born, but during the pregnancy, I'd never really thought about too much and what my life could look like. I have a lot of deaf friends and they've had hearing children, and it felt very rare that them or any of them would have deaf kids. So I didn't think too much about it. But when I found out that after my son was born and he was deaf, it actually hit me pretty hard. Because as we know that during the screenings, they use the word failed. Your son's hearing has failed. And I didn't expect it. I thought I would be over the moon to find out my child was deaf, which of course I am. But at that time, when they used this word, I thought, okay, what life will he have? How will we raise our child? When I think about my husband and my life, we've experienced so many barriers growing up, and now this is another generation in which we're going to have to be advocating and supporting our child throughout their life, and they might have the same barriers as us. So going back to that word failed, I felt I'm here with this beautiful baby, and 2 days after the screening check, you're telling me my child has failed. And that label just made me feel ill. You're telling me my beautiful baby, this child who's ready to explore the world, has failed? I mean, I cried like you wouldn't believe. And it took a while to accept that this is going to be a part of life and my child will experience barriers, but I can't let that stop him. So, yeah, it just makes me emotional thinking about it. So when I think about having to advocate for the whole life and navigate this space with my husband, it was a lot.
Yeah, look, I think that's really interesting because I think for a lot of hearing parents, it's really just about the shock. They don't know anything about deafness. They're like, what do you mean? There's so many questions. What does that mean for my child? But for you, you could almost see the future, so to speak. It's that different lens. And I think, look, I'm not in any way the same, but I think that I had that knowledge before and I'd worked with deaf kids before. And so when I had my deaf child, Frank, I definitely looked at what would his future look like, because I'd seen it. So, for you, it's such a unique experience and you've lived this life already. So, yeah, and I think that word failed, wow. I know I felt the same. I'm just like, wow, that's the first thing you say about my baby is so negative. Really? What is that? He's perfect.
And the worst thing is the parent, it's your first time with a baby. You're ready to enter the world with your child, and this is what you're telling me. So I had to give feedback to the hospital that this wasn't appropriate. But when I had my second child, it was a very different experience. I was almost prepared for the eventuation that they would use this term. But when I met with the audiologist, I said, please don't use this terminology. Just tell me if my child is deaf or hearing. And this kind of shook them a little bit. They were a little bit like, oh, okay, that's not the terminology I use. And usually parents aren't fazed by it, but you want me to use deaf or hearing or... It's like, well, yeah, we're just the same as anyone else. I just want to know if my child is deaf or hearing. So the audiologist was like, they're deaf. And we loved it. We loved that the audiologist bought into what it is we were trying to achieve and we could celebrate this moment. So this experience with my second child was so much more different. I felt more confident, more assertive. I had learned a lot from my first child.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's a really important message that our words have power. That one word, it can really impact people. So I think that's a really great message. And I love that you're sharing that, and that second time was so different for you and you learnt from that first experience, you get ready for that advocacy. My next question is really, when you were navigating this space, you already had that lived experience as a deaf person, but was there anything that still surprised or shocked you about the journey? particularly in those early years, before school. Obviously, your first child, Felix, is now at school. We were talking about that before. That's so exciting. But in that early intervention space, was there anything that, shocked you at all?
Oh my goodness, too many appointments. Oof. I never imagined that there would be that many. I thought, oh, deaf child, I'm deaf. I know about my experience. It'll be fine. Yeah. But really, I was contacted so often by so many different therapists and services and organizations. And I just thought, oh, it's a bit overwhelming. And I remember one organization contacted me and said, oh, you're a deaf parent. Oh, you don't need us then. You've got the deaf community to support you. And I thought, whoa, sorry. What? I do have the deaf community, yes, but do you know what services are out there for deaf parents? There are not many specialized services that suit deaf families. You can't just say, oh, the deaf community is there to support you. That's not what they're there for. And it just showed a really limited understanding as to what our culture and community looks like and what support looks like for deaf parents. So I did decide to cut off that service. I didn't like that attitude. But also, we're going through the same challenges with our deaf kids that even hearing parents are experiencing as well. Sure, as parents, we're different, but our children are going through the same struggles, the barriers, early intervention services, and it is overwhelming. And I am fortunate that I've got my life experience. I understand what it's like to support my child based on my experiences, but it is different when I think about myself growing up and what adults experience now.
Yeah, I think all those appointments as well for us, I just was like, wow. And I know, all our children have CIs. My boy has one and both your kids have bilateral. There are so many appointments just in that little phase of life, that rehabilitation phase. And I know it was a lot for families when I was counselling them, but I wasn't prepared when it happened to us for that world. It just felt like that world is just so unique. And sometimes there can be this conflict between deaf culture and community and that medical world. And how do you balance that?
Well, really, my intention is to open as many doors for my children, to give them as many options in life as possible. I did decide to give the cochlear implant to my children. And we know that from 0 to 5, our kids' brains are sponges, and that's the time you give them language, spoken, signed, written, whatever it might be. And as they grow up and get older, maybe they decide they don't want one or the other. Maybe they want to focus on spoken skills, but as long as they have language and as long as they have options. And if they get fed up with the hearing aids and don't want to wear them, it could be a bit difficult for them later in life. But from 0 to 5, it's a good time to introduce it, and then they can decide what they want later on, as long as they've got that choice. I remember my husband, when we decided to implant my children, it actually took a long time for him to accept the concept of the cochlear implant. He had hearing aids, and I myself have one implant. So I've gone through that experience, and I've seen the access that he has with hearing aids. And all of us have very similar levels of hearing loss. But his hearing is far less than what I can pick up with my cochlear. But I'm a stronger signer, so we kind of complement and overlap each other in the ways we communicate and our degrees of hearing. And we know that hearing aids don't help our children at all, so it was easy for us to decide the cochlear. We didn't want them to grow up without it because, I enjoy listening to things and listening to sounds, whether that's music or TV or chatter in the background. We enjoy having that access to it, and I think it's important for my children to have access to it as well.
Yeah. I feel like you have this really rich understanding of both languages, both worlds as well. And so giving them everything from the start and then allowing them to make that choice, it's a beautiful way, I think. And I know that your two kids are actually quite different in how they use language. Your boy speaks quite a lot, your eldest boy, right? And then Sophie's more sign dominant. Would that be right?
Well, yes, I think it's because of the influences on their life. My boy was born through COVID and very limited access to seeing other people out there. He would see my mother-in-law quite regularly, and she can sign, but she would speak at the same time. She would use SimCom, or simultaneous communication. And I think he's influenced by the signing and speaking at the same time. And with his teacher of the deaf, I asked for extra support with speech as well, and he gets the signing at home. Whereas with my daughter, she's heavily influenced by a signing environment. She sees my boy go to a deaf kinder. She sees more friends now. So they've just had different experiences. And she's more interested in signing. They both wear their implants, then their hearing aids. And my daughter's too. She's still quite young, but she's definitely showing a lot more interest in signing. I don't know. It's just very interesting.
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of how kids will use and choose language the way they need that suits them, you know? I feel like that's a really beautiful example of our kids, and when we give them all the choices, they will pick what they need and what works for them. I love that. I think that's beautiful.
Both of them have been using Auslan since day one, since birth. Whereas with Sophie, she's learnt from her brother Felix, and what he will do is he'll actually turn his voice off because he realizes she can't speak yet. She hasn't developed those skills. So he turns his voice off. He rarely speaks with her because he knows he's clicked that it just won't work for her. And I think it's beautiful. Oh, I love that so much.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. Okay, advocacy. I have a big advocacy question for you. So I know for hearing parents, wow, advocacy is this huge mountain to climb, you know, because they don't really have that knowledge there at the start of deafness. You know, they're being told a lot of different information. People just sort of play on their fear as well. There's all these things happening. For you, as a deaf parent, how has that advocacy experience been for you with your kids in that medical space? And, you know, in NDIS and all of that, childcare, whatever it might be, how has that experience been for you?
Well, number one for me is interpreting. And that takes a lot of advocating. Every time I go to an appointment, I want an interpreter. If I want to check out a childcare, a support service, a hearing organisation or service provider, I want to make sure that interpreters are there. And the pressure's always on me. The amount of times I've rocked up to an event or to a place and there's no interpreter, I think I have wasted my time. And they say, oh, we can still do it. We can write on pen and paper. And I'm like, no, it's not acceptable to me. Can you imagine me trying to wrangle my children at the same time as writing notes? I need my hands. Thank you very much. I need to sign. So interpreters are paramount to my access. It's important that they're booked in advance, because you rarely get an interpreter at the last minute. And VRI, an online interpreter, is not my preference either. It's so hard to focus on a screen while the kids are running around. The internet can drop out. Maybe I don't have my laptop on me. So there's a lot of considerations, and I have to fight really hard for the provision of interpreters. Sometimes I feel discriminated against by schools, hospitals, childcare. Think, oh, deaf people, they're not as smart, they're not as capable. They might have worked with kids who have language deprivation. And really, it's important that we recognise that everyone, not just deaf people, but everyone is different. And one deaf person does not represent the entire cohort.
Yeah, that's a big thing. that we as hearing parents don't experience. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, that needs to change, because I feel like it's just not acceptable. It's not acceptable. We need to be respecting deaf parents as the expert of their child. I think, if anyone is an expert of deaf kids, it's the deaf person, right? So I feel like that's something that we really need to educate and advocate on, because deaf parents actually are the experts of us as hearing parents, and so that needs to be respected more regularly moving forward.
But it's also a challenge, particularly within the Cochlear space. I mean, there are so many deaf kids. There are not many deaf parents with deaf kids who've got the Cochlear. But the ones I have met have gone through very similar experiences and incredible pressure on us. And it's not right. And we have to challenge their way of thinking and their attitude. We need to teach them about our way of life, our culture, our language. And it comes back to language. That's my number one thing. It doesn't matter what else takes place, language, whether you got cochlears or not. So there's a lot of fighting that takes place when it comes to access and language.
Wow. Yeah, I think really this is actually a great interview, because it's showing that difference in our journeys. Yes, of course, there's similarities through our advocacy and all wanting the best for our kids. But actually, there's this added layer of these barriers that you have, around that lack of awareness and understanding of deaf people and that deaf world. You're having to advocate your whole life for this. And I know, I just got goosebumps thinking about that.
It's definitely a different experience as a parent compared to as an adult in my own life. So when I think about my children's, I think, how can these people out there think about my kids this way? How can they tell me what's what? Us as parents know our children.
Yeah, I know this has happened before, where you've arrived somewhere and they've worked out that Felix actually talks, and so they start to talk to him and not you. Does that happen a lot?
Most people out there have been pretty good, and they will default to me. But when they realize that he can hear reasonably well, they might kind of, I guess, out of curiosity, give it a crack and try and speak to him. And I think, excuse me, I don't know who this person is. Why are you speaking to my child? And sometimes it can be an incredibly uncomfortable situation. Sometimes Felix will interpret the interaction for me.
Oh, wow, yeah. I feel like you're probably at a point where you're so aware of it now, you can stop them before it happens straight away. Okay, so the next question is around advice, because, we should provide some context here. You've actually worked in education for quite a long time as an ALM. Yeah. And we've actually worked together briefly. That was so good. Lovely. Yeah, it was so lovely. And I've just watched you in action. You're fantastic. And I think you have such knowledge in this space as well. But I guess for me, I wanted to ask what advice you could provide to hearing parents who, are on this journey and navigating this system. And there's just so much overwhelm and this big feeling of not doing enough. They constantly feel like they're not good enough, because they don't know Auslan to that fluent level. So sometimes they're like, it's just too hard. I can't do this. What advice could you give them?
A few things. Be kind to yourself. Be patient. There's no finish line. It's not a race. You can take your time. If you're not happy with the services that you're meeting with, if you feel something deep down that something's wrong here, change it. Find the person that suits your child. As I said before, parents know their children best. So do that. Follow that instinct. Don't fall into a habit of just powering on and drowning in all these services that might not be the right thing. Be kind to yourself. You're all doing a great job. Your children will be fine. You know the best for them. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter who's there, hearing or deaf. It's important to have relationships. Don't do it alone. Don't be isolated. The world is a diverse place, and it's important for our kids to be exposed to that. Another tip, language. Focus on language, whatever that looks like. I mean, there's so much advice I could give, but yeah.
Yeah, I know. And I feel like... Sorry, one more question about that regarding language. I've watched you. You're amazing with unpacking language with your two little ones. And it's so natural, for you. When we met up recently for that beautiful catch-up, I was just watching you and watching how natural and easy you sort of unpacked and communicated with them. And they were just absorbing it all. They're so clever. And I just think, what are some quick tips maybe that have been big for you that you could provide hearing parents that they might be able to do at home and replicate at home?
Make time with your kids. Quality time. Chat with them. Engage with them. And it's not necessarily teaching, but it's the incidental stuff. It's playing with them. It's joining in on what they're doing. It's letting them join in on what you're doing. So language is not always about direct teaching. It's about exposure. It's about just being involved in what it is they're doing. And really, they'll learn quicker that way. It means when you do it that way, they're excited about the world. It's about going out to different places. It's about reading different books. My children, they love to read. So quality time is my tip.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I feel like we know that kids learn best through play, right? Instead of that stagnant, structured, language-focused time, it just doesn't really work in the same way. Yeah, no, it's very natural to do through play. Oh my goodness, Kim, thank you for being here. I appreciate you so much, honestly. You're my first deaf mum on here. I'm very excited to share your story. It's just lovely.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me here. I really appreciate it. It's important that all parents see that families are not the same. We are very, very diverse. We can go through similar journeys together, but everyone is unique. So thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I love that. Thank you.